Hello, everybody. I'm Mr. Post. If we haven't met already, this is U.S. history, and we're going to be going over Chapter 13, the Industrial Revolution. So let me present my screen for you, and we'll get started. Okay, so this was considered the machine age, and as most people know, that this is kind of the beginning of the modern U.S. history. This is after the Civil War, and which means is that we were trying to rebuild a country, and there's a lot of technological advances, there's a lot of innovation, and there's a lot of entrepreneurs that are starting businesses. And something else that we discover is there's a lot of people that get rich, really rich, very, very rich. So we'll see. We'll talk about that in a minute. So times are changing. From the years 1860 in the 1900s, the United States changed from a farming economy to an economy based on industry, and that's true today. Industry, the activity of making goods in factories, which is the innovation, has also started to improve during this time. The government started giving out thousands of new patents for innovation. So what's a patent? Patent is a government grant that allows the inventor to make, use, and sell an invention. This is important because this means that your ideas cannot be used without your permission. And also, you can make money off it. So, for example, like people always talk about starting an app or creating a new business that eventually gets bought by a bigger business, and they make a lot of money. For example, Instagram wasn't owned by Facebook at first. Instagram was its own entity, and eventually Facebook realized that Instagram was a great idea, and they decided to buy it. Same thing happens all the time with other companies. Beats by Dr. Dre was its own company, and Apple decided to buy it. And now Apple owns Beats, and they sell Beats as part of their like package deals when they you upgrade for the phones or the different sound systems that they use for the computers. You don't need to worry about that. All right. Thomas Edison invented more things than any other person in history. He had over 1,000 patents, and he worked in a place called what he called the Invention Factory in Milano Park, New Jersey, and was known as the Wizard of Milano Park. Some of his inventions include the electric light bulb, the phonograph, and the alkaline battery. So these are some of the pictures that notice that the battery is huge, and the light bulb looks similar to what we have today, but it's a little different, obviously. And the phonograph, which is essentially a record player. We don't have to do that. All right. The two industries that got huge in this time were the oil industry and the steel industry. So the oil industry began in 1840 when a man saw a thick, dark liquid bubbling from the ground in Pennsylvania, and people called it black gold. Edwin Blake drilled the first oil well in 1859, and people came in a mad rush to Pennsylvania to drill for oil. More oil and more uses for it came over the next 10 years and helped machines run smoothly. It also provided kerosene, gasoline, oil for running engines eventually. It was a very useful substance, and because it was hard to get, it could make you a lot of money. So the steel industry for hundreds of years was basically, iron was built to build buildings. The problem with iron was that it rusted, it broke, it was more malleable, it could bend. Steel also was steel was a thing for a long time, except that it was really expensive to make. You only saw steel like in little pieces of jewelry, um, things like silverware, like people like eating utensils, plates, what have you. But then all of a sudden, in the 1850s, the Bessemer process was invented and made steel a lot more cheaply and easily. But it wasn't used widespread until Andrew Carnegie decided to use steel to build a bridge across East St. Louis to St. Louis. Now, East St. Louis wasn't a developed town originally. It was just a big wooded area that looked across St. Louis. And until the Eads Bridge was built, which is the first all steel bridge to be built across the Mississippi River, which is essentially a mile long. That didn't happen until Andrew Carnegie decided that the only way to be able to cross the Mississippi safely is through this material. And so he went and bought and ordered steel beams all over the country, because the Bessemer process allowed steel to be created in a more effective, efficient way that allowed it to be somewhat affordable. After the Eads Bridge, Andrew Carnegie saw that steel could be the future. And that's where skyscrapers started popping up throughout cities, because cities were only so big. But no, they're only, because there's only 2 or 3 story buildings. All of a sudden, when you start building up, it created a whole new way of being able to live in skyscrapers or offices or anything else that allowed people to have factories in some cases, which actually ended up not being a very good thing. But being that, like, we started building towards the sky because the steel beams and concrete and bricks allowed us to move to the sky. The growth, so problems did arise. The growth of the oil and steel industry also brought some problems. Owners of the oil steel companies became very rich. Workers were paid very little and had very dangerous jobs. We'll talk about that in a minute. Pollution started happening. People were just tearing down trees and dumping waste into water, and all of a sudden we stopped having clean water and fresh air to breathe, and we didn't really have anything really nice to be around. There was no beautiful parks or places to go. It was just dirty, dingy to live in the cities. There wasn't very much, wasn't really great of infrastructure for people to live. The people were living in these tenants that were 10 to 15 to 20 people live in a very small area. And there's oil leaks that would get into the soil and poison crops and animals, what have you. And the smoke from steel factories made it very unhealthy to breathe the air. It was not a good time for air quality or water quality and or even living quality. But there was America was growing at an exceptional rate for 2 reasons. One, because we have the ability to build it, and also more and more immigrants were coming to our country to work because there was an abundance of jobs in factories and the promise of getting rich. All right. So let's talk about those poor working conditions. In 1900s, many workers would work 12-hour shifts, and then another group would work that next 12 hours, and the process would repeat itself. Most factories were unsafe. There was poor lighting, little fresh air, unsafe machinery. Time and time again, you heard about people dying on the job or getting mauled by a machinery where they lose an arm or a foot, become blind. Oftentimes, people in coal mines and textile factories would develop lung problems because of the air they're breathing. You have to remember that, like in a steel mill now, you have to have so much gear to go in and actually work on the steel that they're creating with ventilators and different types of safety equipment to help them protect themselves from the heat that the Bessemer furnaces are producing. Back then, they had just jeans and a t-shirt and not even a hard hat. And so it made it so very difficult for workers to be able to live healthy lives after they stopped working. But it didn't really matter because there was no labor unions yet, nor were there regulations to make sure factories were safe for workers, and workers didn't have rights. So if you got hurt on the job, you're just fired. And then they would bring in another person to come in and take your spot because there's 10 people waiting at the door for a job. Like I said, they had very little rights if you got hurt, sick, or you couldn't make it into work because you had a kid get sick or what have you. You were just fired right there, and they'd hire someone new. And that was kind of the problem, is that workers weren't treated like human beings. They're treated like just things that help them make money. So another thing that was the problem was that people were creating company towns. At first, this was an interesting idea because it allowed people to have a home that couldn't afford a home, possibly. But companies then went and were requiring people to stay in these company towns. And what made it a big problem is that they weren't really paying them in money either. So parts of their paycheck were made in scrip, which is money only good at company town store, which was owned by the company. The rent that they were paying was going to the company. So essentially, the company would pay you, and then they would go directly back into the company's pocket, which is great for the company. But essentially, what you have is a very, very low paying, a very low cost workforce, close to even though they were free to leave, they didn't really have anywhere to go because they made money. So essentially, you had them stuck in a very close to a slavery situation. It's not slavery, but it was a very close to situation where they didn't have very many choices. And company towns now don't exist in the United States. There's actually Grant City started out as a company town. So many places, there were still places around this area that had company towns. And oftentimes workers would owe more money to the company than they were able to pay off. So, and so that would create a situation where if they spoke up about the problems in the company towns, they were just fired. And then they were kicked out of the company town because you only were able to live there if you worked there. So that made people not want to cause issues and stayed quiet. So that's important to remember. The workforce for women, women did work. A lot of times they were secretaries, switchboard operators, etc., that type of job. But eventually they needed more workers, and they found that they could pay the white men cost a lot of money to compare to women and children. So they would hire women, especially in things like textile mills and food packing plants and other factories that needed people to be able to do fine motor skills because their fingers were a little smaller than men's. And they were able to pay them pennies on the dollar, 10 cents on the dollar. If a man received $1, women would receive only 10 cents. And that's not per hour. And that's not equitable whatsoever. But women would take it because they didn't have many other choices. And and still today, women are not getting paid fairly. And this is still a huge issue that people are dealing with today. And so, and hopefully it was in the 1970s, almost 60 cents on the dollar. and now it's approximately 85 cents to the dollar, which is still not right. It's and there's been many lawsuits throughout throughout those decades that have made it so women have fought for their rights to actually get paid fairly. Children now are now allowed to work in these places, but before there was no child labor laws, or when there were labor laws in place, they were overlooked. People were not enforcing them. And so the biggest issue is that children were being used in factories as mechanics to service the huge and dangerous machines. Kids were losing their fingers, their hands, getting blinded, but these machines were packed into these factories so tightly that only the people that were the size of children could get back there and service them. And they also were paid very poorly. Other jobs that the children were being given and paid very poorly was in coal mines, and they're called breaker boys. And they were tasked with the idea that the coal would fall off the cart onto the train tracks, and so these kids would go and just pick up the coal and put them back into an empty cart so that there wouldn't be any wasted coal. These kids could barely stand up by the end of the day. They're no older than 13 years old. So imagine a fifth grader going to these coal mines all day for 12 hours, just picking up coal all day long. And so obviously there's physical problems, but there's also the fact that these kids were breathing in these toxic fumes and developing black lung at a very young age, and getting paid a fraction of the price of what a man would be getting instead of a kid. Labor unions started popping up, which we see labor unions today. Before, they were always squashed. They were actually alive. They were banned in a lot of companies. If you started forming a union, they'd fire you right then. The first union was made by Samuel Gropers. It was the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. Companies did not like unions because oftentimes they would make it so they have to spend more money on their labor, and which is important to remember because they were going to stop labor unions from being there or being as strong as much as they could. And what that resulted in is a lot of violence. So violence would break out. Strikes is the union members would all agree to stop working until their demands were met, often ranging from higher wages, better working conditions, or not having to live in company towns. And this isn't like, it doesn't seem like a very big demands, but the companies didn't want to give the labor unions anything because that meant that they would ask for more. So what companies would do was hire private detectives, or they would call the police and pay the police to do like under the table to break up the strike. Or even in the Pullman strike situation, the military was called in to break up the strike because all throughout the country, the railroads had shut down and people were burning different cars and in the train stations to prove a point that like they can't be pushed around. Now, people were dying. People died in all of these Haymarket, Homestead, and Pullman strikes. And in the early 1900s, a lot of people didn't want to belong to the union because it was dangerous business to belong to one. What that meant, though, was that eventually, if you did belong to a labor union and you stuck it out, they eventually got a lot of power because people like Teddy Roosevelt helped them negotiate contracts and also pass laws of what's called collective bargaining agreements, which means that the bosses had to listen to the union leaders or they were breaking the law. And that made a huge difference in the way that people were treated as far as laborers went. Now, every 10 or 20 years, there's always a like cyclical movement of how labor unions are viewed. Sometimes they're viewed as something that's bringing down the economy, that they're too expensive. So then, thus, products are cost more. Or they're thought of as something that is protecting the people that are don't normally have a voice, all of a sudden have a voice in the labor union, because a lot of companies and bosses don't really care whether or not the laborers are getting what they want, unless they demand it. And the only way you get heard is through numbers. If one person strikes, that means you just quit. But if all 1,000 of the either laborers walk out, then the company has to shut down and they start losing money. And that is really what makes people listen, is when they start losing money and it costs less money to pay the workers more than have them to strike, then that's when things get done. And in the Homestead strike in 1892, there was that was in a steel mill strike for Andrew Carnegie, and one of the people that were in charge of that particular steel mill called the Pinkerton detectives, and they were trying to break the picket line so people could so the scabs, the people that were not part of the union, could go and cross the picket line and actually work the steel mill, and it resulted in a huge fight and violence. So there's been a lot of violence when it comes to fighting for like working condition rights, which is something you wouldn't think you'd have to fight for, but it is something that is being fought for still today. That's enough said about that. So that is the end of that presentation. So I'm going to exit that. Sorry. There we are. I'm going to stop presenting. All right. So in closing, guys, I know this is a bit longer than just a normal presentation than I would have had. This is new to me as far as how things go. But what I'm going to have you guys do is finish your presidential project by Wednesday. And then you have you'll be posting an assignment today that has to deal with the Industrial Revolution. And then on Monday, you'll have some more other assignments for Wednesday and Friday as well. So please watch this presentation all the way through and check Google Classroom. And we'll have our Google meetings coming this Tuesday and Wednesday, and Thursday and Friday. So I will see most of you either Tuesday or Wednesday. All right. Talk to you guys soon.